Bring us up to speed
Thanks,
on what's
David.
going on in the streets of Iraq, because there seems to be something of a transition going on that some of us may not have been paying attention to.
This is a really interesting story, David. So these protests actually started last October. This has been going on for almost 3 months now. And it started when the Iraqi government fired a very, very popular general who was one of the leaders in the anti-ISIS fight inside Iraq. His firing inspired a small demonstration, and that demonstration was put down very hard by the Iraqi government, as in they used live rounds and tear gas canisters and killed several of the demonstrators. That just sparked this youth movement, and the young Iraqis flocked to the streets, and now you've had essentially 3 months of solid protests. And the themes are anti-corruption, accountability, and anti-foreign influence, by which they mostly mean the Iranians, not the Americans.
Which strikes me, at least, as a significant shift. And as you pointed out, it appears to be maybe generational, because after the fall of Saddam Hussein and what happened in the aftermath, there was sort of a general assumption that Iran was really increasing its influence, increasing influence. A majority, as I recall, of Iraqis are Shia. They're not Sunni. So is this really a threat to the influence of Iran in Iraq?
It absolutely is. This is what they're protesting, is this outsized influence of Iran inside the Iraqi state. What's interesting about these demonstrations is Americans and other Westerners have been looking at Iraq through an ethno-sectarian lens. We've thought about Sunni Arabs and Kurds and Shia Arabs for well over a decade, almost 2 decades now. But this demonstration is internal to the Shia Arab majority. So this is a group of young Shia Arabs who are protesting a government that consists of mostly old Shia Arabs. It's a very different kind of demonstration. It kind of reflects it reminds me of the demonstrations of the 60s, not that I remember them, but in America and France and elsewhere, of the youth really protesting almost their parents. And of course, what adds another dimension to this is these protesters are largely either the people who fought against ISIS or their brothers, cousins, sisters. And it's become quite a social revolution. There are women out as an active part of this protest, very, very prominent in a society that has not been very gender integrated.
So as someone who may be too much old school, my initial reaction is to think Iran's not going to sit back and let this happen. Iran has not always played by the rules, I think it's fair to say, in intervening in the area and other places. Is Iran taking any action to counter this revolution?
Well, most outside observers credit the very violent crackdown. And again, they killed tens or scores in the first days of the protests, but the violence has continued. Last I checked, the death count is approaching 500 officially, and it's probably higher than that. So there are 500 dead, young, mostly Shia Arabs as a result of this demonstration. So that's a lot of people, and Iran is taking most of the blame for it. So perversely, as the Iranians get blamed for the response, they're becoming even less and less popular, and their response seems to be backfiring against them. But you're right, don't count them out. Iran has a lot of influence in the region. But this move by the President Barham Salih to offer to resign and say, I'm not going to back this candidate who has very strong Iranian ties, shows that there's resistance to the Iranian influence inside Iraq. And Barham Salih is someone we know well. He lived here in Washington during the 90s before the Saddam Hussein regime fell. He's a known figure, and he's generally considered relatively pro-American.
We're talking with Douglas Ollivant, a fellow at New America down in Washington. Douglas, to what extent is there a socioeconomic aspect to this? Because in other places, particularly in the Middle East, we've seen particularly young males who do not have employment, do not have resources, and they tend to be more activist. Is there an element here of lack of employment, lack of job skills, lack of a future?
There absolutely is. The demonstrations, actually, there were some precursor demonstrations that were mostly done by college graduates and graduate students who couldn't find any employment. The fundamental problem with the Iraqi economy is it's state-directed. There's almost no private sector, and the only way to get a job is to have a government job. But the government simply has no more jobs and no more money and can't offer jobs to these youth. As we all know, only a private sector can really generate enough jobs to keep employing a rapidly growing population. So it initially started with economic motives, and it was initially, I think, primarily a middle-class, college-educated, but then came from the lower classes, the laboring classes, those who are protesting that, hey, I don't have any jobs either. It's not just the college graduates who are suffering. It's also the lower classes. So there's absolutely an economic aspect. They wonder quite legitimately why a country that's producing almost 5 million barrels of oil a day can't generate an economy that can employ its own people.
Yeah, which may go back to the corruption issue a little bit. We talked a little bit about
Absolutely.
the possible involvement of Iran from the outside. What about the U.S.? What should the U.S. response be? Are we better off letting this alone so that we aren't perceived as an outsider really getting involved?
Well, at first, the U.S. response was too muted, I think. But we, belatedly in late October came out and said that, yeah, we generally support the protesters. We support the things that they're asking for, at least. We support more accountability. We support fair elections. We support an economy that works, and certainly the anti-corruption file. So I think we've done about right. We are generally supportive. The danger, of course, is if the United States gets too far forward, then this becomes an American-sponsored or American-led protest and would generate all kinds of conspiracy theories. So there's definitely the possibility for blowback from American support as well. And I generally think the U.S. government has actually played this pretty well, being quietly supportive without getting too far over our skis, so to speak.
Exactly, Douglas. And that led me to my final question, which is there an argument here that President Trump's administration actually is accomplishing some real good by pulling back from the region? There's been a lot of criticism when it went on in northeast Syria, for example. But in this instance, at least, might the president be right in saying, you know what, we're better off pulling back and letting them take care of their problems?
That's a really complex question. I think we'd have to look very case by case, country by country, and even specific sector by specific sector. But there is certainly something to be said for letting them take care of it themselves. It was Lawrence of Arabia who said that it's better that the Arabs do it acceptably than that the British, or in this case the Americans, do it perfectly. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Let them figure this out for themselves.